In tonight's workshop, we're going to be talking about making your script or film easier to sell. And specifically, we're going to talk about 10 creative elements that really pay off. This is an important workshop because it's perfectly possible to write a screenplay that you can't get anybody to read. And if you happen to produce a screenplay that doesn't have any of these elements, producers will not read it because they know nobody will be willing to watch a film or television show based on it. Our objectives in this workshop are very straightforward. The first thing is we're going to talk about what it means to win. You need to understand exactly why you're writing your screenplay or making your film. And if you don't understand that information, it's almost impossible for you to be successful at achieving your objectives. If you're writing your project to express something that you think it's really important for people to know, that's one thing. If you're writing to create a piece of intellectual property that makes money, that is a completely different thing. We'll talk about why your objective is very important in just a couple of minutes. We'll also be talking about the 10 key creative elements that really make a difference to whether or not a screenplay or a film is likely to be successful in the marketplace. We'll talk about why these elements make a screenplay easier to sell, easier to pitch, easier to fund, easier to get distribution for when it becomes a film, and how they make it easier to produce. We're going to learn what those elements are and exactly how to use them to your advantage when you're pitching your projects and if you're using this information to determine how to select a screenplay that will actually be easy for you to turn into a film, that will have some kind of momentum on its own. Um, we'll be talking about that as well. We'll also be talking about content. It's funny right now because content has this meme that content's a bad word. Don't call my work content. It's a screenplay. Don't call my work content. It's a book. Don't call my work content. It's a graphic novel. Don't call my work content. And they feel that many creatives feel that calling work content belittles it. It makes it's words by the pound or pictures by the pound. But actually, thinking about your work as content is very empowering. And in a moment, at the end of this workshop, we'll be talking about exactly why and why the word content is actually not a bad word. It actually makes business sense and it actually makes creative sense as well. Now, I want to be candid here because I think I'm going to say something that I do not hear enough people say in the entertainment industry. I think that's because a lot of people make their money off of telling screenwriters how to write screenplays and they talk to and telling producers how to make films. And the problem is that it sets a series of unrealistic expectations that translate into people feeling bad all the time. It also a lot of times translates into people spending money they shouldn't be spending and translates into them feeling wasting a lot of time that they shouldn't be wasting to achieve objectives that they're never going to be successful achieving. To be clear, a very tiny fraction of screenplays written ever become films. A microscopic quantity of screenplays that get written and get sold as spec scripts actually become films. The vast majority of screenplays that are written, they never get purchased. They never get optioned. Most don't even get pitched. A lot of times people write screenplays and they will go 2, 3, 5 years screwing around with one particular screenplay, and they never ever show it to a producer who's in a position to actually produce it. Now, now that's exacerbated by the fact that even the best and most successful screenwriters in Hollywood have a tiny success rate when it comes to selling projects that actually get to the silver screen. You would be shocked at how many people have Emmys, how many people have won Academy Awards, how many people have produced projects, have written projects that have become $100 million movies that literally cannot sell another screenplay or maybe they can get it optioned, but the option money isn't very good and it never turns into a film, so they never actually get a good payday. It is just that kind of business. The reason that's important for you to know if you're a screenwriter is you're not a failure. You are not a failure if you write a screenplay and it doesn't get produced. You are not a failure if in fact, you're really quite successful if you're routinely writing screenplays, pitching them, and to people that can actually say yes And even when you get a no, even when they say, "We seriously considered this project, we thought about doing it, but we can't say yes right now," that is a huge win because most people never even get that far. Now, it doesn't mean you should give up writing screenplays. We'll talk about why in a moment. But what it does mean is you don't have to beat yourself up because you have not been successful at selling your screenplay. You do not have to beat yourself up if you have written 10 screenplays and you haven't sold any of them. That is actually pretty normal. Turns out that writing screenplays is a numbers game. And if you have 20 or 30 or 40 of them, it's much easier to be successful because at any given time, if you start pitching one and it's not going well, you can fade over to pitching another. And on the off chance you're in the room with somebody who can say yes, you have something for them to say yes to. So I just think this is important to say because I think a lot of people feel really bad that they can't sell their screenplay. And you should just understand that's the actual default answer for almost everybody who is a screenwriter. Most people are not selling screenplays. And it's particularly difficult right now from a variety of perspectives, especially as the budget for your screenplay goes up. The next thing it's important to understand if you're a filmmaker is that the vast majority of film projects never make it to any screen. So there's a lot of people who have said, hey, I want to make a movie and I want it to cost $500,000 and I want it to feature this star or that star. And that thing has never gotten anywhere near being produced. Or I want to make something for $1 million or for $5 million. People I know personally have wasted 5, 10 years trying to get a particular movie made and had no success. Now, I don't necessarily the thing I regret about that, I would say, is the fact that a lot of times when they're producing a film or trying to produce a film and they're spending the money required to do development, they are spending money that they don't have. And they're doing things like mortgaging their houses or they're putting huge debt on credit card, $100,000 because they're trying to buy their way in to the film industry. And it often does require you to put up a certain amount of your own capital in order to be able to in order to acquire the screenplay, in order to acquire the initial talent, in order to get distribution, etc. So if we all understand, we all accept that most film projects never make it to any screen. And actually, the chance of a film project making it to screen goes down the more you spend on it. If you spend $20,000 or $50,000 a film project, the chance that thing's going to make a profit is actually higher. And really, because it doesn't cost that much, and you can actually get the thing out the door, and you can actually get it someplace that it can be sold, the chance of it getting produced is higher. So cheap is good. Cheap is fast. Cheap is something that could actually conceivably be profitable. So if you think, wow, I'm a total failure, I haven't been able to be successful producing this $500,000 project or this $1 million project or this $5 million project, trust me, that's like the default state of affairs. That's actually how it normally is. Mostly that's the case. You don't have to feel bad. What you do have to think about is why you might be spending so much time and so much money and taking such huge risks to produce something that's very likely not to be successful no matter what you do. And maybe you should think about reversing direction and producing stuff that's much easier, much faster, much more likely to be profitable instead. Producing the $20,000 film, or at most the $50,000 film, or at very most the $100,000 film. Maybe that's the ballpark you should be working in, particularly if you're doing your first films. So I just want to be honest and talk about this straight up because I think a lot of the stuff that I see being done around Hollywood, a lot of the workshops I see people giving, a lot of the books that I see people reading, they're just selling this version of the industry that hasn't existed since the 1980s. We live and work in a completely different market, in a completely different world. And in some ways it's better because it's easy to get distribution for content these days if you happen to finish it. Getting paid for your work is really hard. The first thing I want to say, and I think is really important for people to hear is start by creating what you love. If you're like most writers or filmmakers, you have to create or you will go crazy. Most of us do not choose to create. We're born wanting to create content. Many of us were writing when we were toddlers. Many of us were trying to make movies the first time we got our hands on a video camera or a phone. That is our nature. It is what we do, and to a significant degree, we create because we do not have the choice not to. And I think if you will just give yourself the permission to create, you will probably be happier and wealthier in every meaningful way, even if your work never hits the big time. And the reason is you're creating for a lot of reasons that don't have anything to do with money. You're creating for a lot of reasons that have everything to do with being a human who wants to express their thoughts in the world, what we call an artist, in other words. And that's not a bad thing. It is not necessarily a horrible idea for you to create what you love, particularly at the beginning. Your first 2 or 3 or 4 screenplays, your first 2 or 3 or 4 books, your first 2 or 3 or 4 films. It's okay for them to be projects of the heart. Straightforward little projects of the heart sometimes really turn into huge winners when they do happen to make it to market, because often they embody a kind of catharsis, a kind of realization that, that people just find charming. They see it and they think, "Oh my god, I felt like that." It's so honest and it's so true and it's so compelling that it just steals hearts. I honestly suggest that people who are writing a screenplay, even if it's unlikely to ever make it to screen, go ahead and finish writing it. Go ahead and create those 100 pages. If you're making a film, if it's not gonna if you can afford to do it cost effectively for 10,000, 20,000, like a small quantity of money, and you can do it and get it out the door, I suggest you totally do it, even if it's not gonna be a blockbuster. The reason is that I think it just being creative and creating something that you deeply care about and taking it to market feels good, and it's very empowering, and in real life, if you're going to be successful, chances are good you're gonna need a few credits, and it's good if it's these little projects of the heart that you've created. It is important to understand that if you do happen to have a project of the heart and it actually does happen to get sold as a screenplay, let's say you've written a screenplay talking about your years in high school and it's a really great story, people fall in love with it, and you actually sell it to a producer, the thing that ends up on screen probably isn't going to look much like what you wrote, because that's just the nature of film. The nature of film, it is collaborative media, everybody brings something to the table, and that means the writer's version of the screenplay is not the version of the screenplay that gets produced. And if you're a filmmaker, your screenplay that you originally purchased, that you had an intent to produce, when you make the series of concessions required by actors and all kinds of other people, might not look entirely like the one you release. That's okay too. A lot of times people feel like I was really screwed over because I didn't get exactly what I wanted. You work in a collaborative industry. If you want to have total control, I strongly urge you to write books. With books, you can have total control. With graphic novels, you can have total control. With film, you're working with other creative people. You're not going to get exactly what you want. That's the game you're in. You have to live with it. So, first, create what you love. Second, create a lot. One screenplay or film does not a career make. I think a lot of times people think, I will write a screenplay and then I will be very successful and then I will write more screenplays. This is not what will happen. You will write one screenplay and then you will write another screenplay and then you will write another screenplay. You will write many screenplays. The good thing about them is they're only about 100, 110 pages long. It's like a novella. And you can write a lot of screenplays. And the more screenplays you have, the more likely you are to sell a screenplay. You use your screenplays as a screenwriter as your calling cards. They're your qualifications. When you want to get an agent or a manager or you want to talk to a producer, you don't want to have one screenplay. You want to have 4 or 5 or 10. You want to say, I'm a screenwriter. I got a lot of screenplays. It just doesn't, it's just the nature of the beast. The more you write, the better. Don't force yourself to focus on one screenplay to the exclusion of all others. If you write a screenplay or you're working on a screenplay and you get stuck and for some reason you just can't get past it, stop working on that screenplay, shove it in the drawer like the rest of us do, go work on your next screenplay. And then at some point in the future, you'll go, oh, I know what to do about that one that was broken, and you'll go back and you'll fix it. But think in terms of producing screenplays on a regular basis. Think of producing lots of screenplays. Don't decide that you need to totally finish one before you start the next. It's just not a linear process. A lot of us will write a screenplay draft, stick it in a drawer, work on another thing for a while, work on another thing for a while, and then roll back and look at the first one and see if we can fix it. Like putting stuff in a drawer for a month or 2 months or a year is totally routine. The next thing is filmmakers too have to create a lot. They really do prove their worth using short films and micro budget features, etc. The little films that filmmakers do are what get them the big opportunities because they demonstrate you have the capacity to take something on the page and put it on the screen. And it also proves that you have the capacity to manage a team all the way from the beginning of a project through the end of a project to produce something that can actually be sold. So these little projects, they're not something that students do. They're not something that amateurs do. The little projects are studies, in a sense, of how you produce a film, how you teach yourself to produce a film, and you use the skills that you master, and a lot of times the team that you develop to take you into larger and larger projects, right? So create a lot. You have to finish a lot of things and show them to people in order to build a career. And then third, you have to schmooze a lot. And writers are the worst, man. And I speak from experience. Writers are the worst because most of the time we want to stay home and write. If we were social people, we'd probably be actors or something else, or producers. We wouldn't be staying at home just typing all the time. But you need to be able to meet people as a writer because you need to be able to meet producers who are willing to put money into your projects. And that means you have to meet producers. They're not going to come knock on your door. And you can send your work out to them, but if your work is caught up in and displayed with about 50 other projects that sort of have the same kind of theme, or they have, like, you're responding to somebody who put out a query for science fiction movies that can be made in a single location for 50K or 100K or $1 million, and you're one of 50 plays that came in, that's not as good as being somebody who meets a writer who meets somebody face to face at a producers conference or a film festival and talks about their project and has a chance to really pitch that producer on a project that happens to be a perfect fit. Because in the latter situation, there's no competition. And that's really the best thing. You really do want to be meeting producers as often as you can. And to be honest with you, almost anybody these days can be a producer if they really want to be. The costs are falling. The costs of actually getting beautiful frames to the screen are crashing. Nobody's business. Getting worldwide distribution is easy. It's never been easier to find an audience, albeit maybe not a paying audience. So producers, there's lots of them. And it's easy for them. It's getting easier for them to be able to produce projects. And especially lower budget projects. So your job as a writer is probably to go to film festivals, go to the producers' conferences, go to the parties, the plays, and talk to people who are actually producing. Whereas producers have to be hanging out with audiences and screenwriters and actors and distributors because they need to make connections as well. This industry is a collaborative industry. You really do have to interface with people on a regular basis in order to be successful. It can't just be the case you're staying at home. So as we dive into talking more about the creative elements that are going to make your project a success, these three elements, these three behaviors are going to be key to you being successful from a financial perspective. The next thing to remember is that this is a business. I talked at the beginning of this project or at the beginning of this presentation about the fact that you really need to know why you are writing a screenplay, why you are producing a film. And I suggested that you create what you love. But if you're making a project of the heart and you don't really have the expectation it's going to make a lot of money, but you're going to get your message out into the world, that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's just like a sculptor might decide to create a sculpture that may not win awards, but he really likes it and he wants it in his own darn garden. And after he's dead, it'll be a monument. They'll put it on his tombstone, right? It's something that he wants to leave the world. It's fulfilling an emotional need. If you're going to do something for a living, if you want to get paid for it and you want to get paid for it over and over again, you want to be successful, you have to realize that the entertainment industry is a business. If people in the industry don't treat it like a business, they tend to go broke. It's a mistake to work with anybody that doesn't treat the entertainment industry like a business because they're going to go broke. And whatever they have in their hands when they go broke is probably going to be tied up in the mess of whatever project they were working on. As a writer, If you meet a producer who seems really friendly and seems really artistically driven and he really doesn't seem to care about the money, that guy's not necessarily going to be so great at producing your project because he has to care about money if he wants to be able to get the thing made and into distribution. And then you need him to care about money so he can pay you. Maybe it might work for a little teeny film, but the more films you want to produce and the more you want to get paid, the more you have to work with people who consider the entertainment industry an actual business. Some elements do make screenplays easier to film, easier to sell, and they make films easier to profitably distribute because they make the projects easier to fund, easier to produce, easier to distribute, and easier to market. If you have projects of the heart you're driven to work on, that's fine, but eventually, to make a living from your work, you have to ensure it's loved by the people in the wider world. And that means you have to write to market and you have to produce to market. You need to think like a professional producer. Writing a screenplay is relatively easy. If you take a lot of screenwriting classes, they can drive you to drink with all the rules and regulations, and God knows there's a lot of them. If you write 10 or 20 screenplays and you get coverage for them all, by the time that's done, you will be able to write screenplays at the drop of a hat because they are very formulaic. And because there are only so many stories you can conceivably tell, and you've developed your voice, you know how to write quickly. And so writing a screenplay in the grand scope of things is relatively easy. It's definitely a skill people can master. A good character and a plot is all you need. And especially if you've done 2 or 3 screenplays, it might only take a few months to get a perfectly finished project out the door. But a profitable producer who acquires that screenplay is going to likely be spending a year or 5 or 10 producing a film project. I've talked to dozens of producers, and I've talked to producers who worked at the very top of the industry, and I've talked to producers that work at the nice, pleasant 20K, 50K, 100K, top tier 250 or 500K markets. And the thing is that they really can't usually get out of spending about a year on a project, putting it together. Even maybe it's something that's really small, basically something the size of a micro budget project that's only 10 or 20K. Yeah, okay, maybe they can get out of that in 6 months. But a profitable producer is usually looking at spending quite a lot of time putting together a project. And these days, most producers aren't really working for the studios. They're independent producers. A lot of times they really are fronting the money and for projects, the first 20% or whatever. And they spend that to buy your screenplay or to option your screenplay, and then they have to run around getting a talent attached, and then they have to figure out if they can get a distribution agreement that's gonna pay them when the project is finished, and if they need to get outside investment, they have to get that together, and they have to do all of that before they move into production and editing and into release. So, one of the reasons you need to be meeting producers is so you can really learn how they think and discover how they specialize, because every producer will have sweet spots. They go, I produced a horror film when it was 50K and it sold right away. So I like to do 50K horror films. And somebody else might be, I like to do 100K science fiction films because I have a real talent when it comes to doing the special effects, and because I know where to get really great talent for those particular projects. I'm friends with a lot of guys that work in sci-fi. And you need to know how each particular producer specializes in what their little niche is, because your projects can then fit into their niche. If you feel like producers are unapproachable deities, I really recommend that you produce some projects yourself so you get past that. Most producers really have more in common with like event organizers or people that party planners or whatever, wedding planners. I know it sounds crazy, but they tend to be very logistical. They tend to be very focused on getting everybody at the right place at the right time, making sure that all the bills get paid. They're approachable because they're always looking for people that they can work with. They're always looking for people. And also, if they find one project and it's not good for them, a lot of times they'll tell somebody else about it. Most producers that you're likely to be working with, particularly if you're just starting out, are going to be very approachable. And there's no reason not to get to know them so you learn how to think like them so you can start figuring out how to give them projects that they'll like. Excuse me. All right. The final thing I wanted to mention is It's important that you know the formulas. And I think sometimes people spend so much time thinking about the hero's journey, the three-act structure, the nine-act structure, Save the Cat, Stanislavski, whatever, that they actually forget that they have to write their own screenplay. So I usually recommend that people, if they come up with an idea for a screenplay, they write it as quickly as they possibly can. They get it, the story out as they understand it as quickly as possible. And then as they go through the editing process, they walk through doing the hero's journey and all of those other things to make sure that their piece actually works on all fronts. I think the other thing is when you're taking notes, if you know the hero's journey, the three-act structure, the nine-act structure, well, excuse me, and all of these rules, you'll be in a really good place because you'll be able to understand the edits a lot of people give you. People that are working in the entertainment industry for a while at every level have used these words so many times and studied this to such an extreme effect that they honestly cannot give you notes without referencing the hero's journey. They'll say, "Oh, the thing is in in your story, when you get to the belly of the beast section, I just don't think it works. There's just not enough at stake." And if you don't know what the hero's journey is and you don't know about the belly of the beast, then you don't know that you don't know what they're talking about. You don't understand where that is, what scene they might even be talking about, or what scenes they might be talking about. So you have to go ahead and learn the formulas if you haven't already. The good news is, if you were to Google either of these topics, you could read the Wikipedia pages and you would find in depth instruction about all of them, and they would even list books that you can read if you felt so inclined. So now let's dive into talking about the 10 elements that are really important. The first one is famous events and stories. The reason that these elements we're going to talk about are so important is because they attach people to your screenplay or they attach people to your film. They're words, like keywords, that you can actually put into your project that will immediately glue an audience onto it. So, famous events and stories. There's no reason not to write or make media about famous events and to use famous events as a backdrop or as elements to move your story along. The Titanic, landing on the moon, the beheading of Anne Boleyn, etc. Giving your scripts context by associating them with these big events and associating them with stories that people already know, even fictional stories that people already know, makes a huge difference because all of a sudden people feel like, "Oh, I'm really interested in that. Oh, I really love that. I really love that story. I really love that world, and I wanna go back to it." So you're promising them an experience that they want, and you're doing it. You don't have to say very many words in order for that to work. You could say, "This is a story, and it's set on the Titanic, and it's right before the iceberg sinks, blah, 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 and it's got aliens." People go, "Wow, Titanic and aliens." But Titanic, wow, aliens, right? It just a few words manages to basically help people go, "Oh, I wanna see that," because they can already start envisioning it because they've already got a good understanding of the Titanic. And the same is true whenever you use familiar terms that are associated with famous events and stories. These fictional elements come with a market that can be identified, reached, and sold to. And it and that similarly, there's also famous people. You are allowed to incorporate real people into your project, and that really does give audiences something to latch on to. People who are fans of Henry VIII represent a specific target market, and God knows I am part of that target market. If you make a film about Henry VIII, I will be watching said film because I really like Henry VIII. I will watch Henry VIII. I will watch Anne Boleyn. I will watch any of the people that are part of the Tudor story. I will even go back to the Plantagenets. I just like the stories, even though I know them all. I want to hear them again or see them again. So if you're going to write about royalty, pick royalty people know. Don't pick people nobody ever heard of because it's so much easier to get 100 million people tuned into your project just by making it about royalty that people actually do know, not rather than fictional people. And the same is true when you're talking about Einstein or talking about Kennedy or talking about Queen Elizabeth too. Incorporating famous people into your work is really important from a variety of perspectives, even if they're only playing bit parts. And you already know this. Forrest Gump was like a treatise on how to write a screenplay that is more successful, specifically because it references famous stories, events, and people. That project was incredibly successful because people wanted to go through that journey through time, meeting all of those famous people with Forrest Gump, right? I can remember all the marketing for it. It was Forrest Gump meeting Kennedy. Forrest Gump, just every aspect of that film's marketing was about taking people on a nostalgic trip back through time. And that's why a lot of and you need to know that because you can put people like Elvis or Trump or Obama and others into your projects as carriers, as characters or as cameos. And there's a workshop on the site called Right of Publicity. If you type Right of Publicity in the search at NFM24, it'll bring up a workshop that where a lawyer talks about the First Amendment and the right of publicity. You can incorporate real world people into your stories. There's rules about how to do it, and there's mistakes that you cannot afford to make. And if you're going to do it, particularly with people that are alive, and especially if they're private people, but you're going to want to make sure that you speak to an attorney. But the point is, don't feel like you have to make up a president. We have to make up a president when you could pick a president that actually exists. Don't feel like you have to make up a place when you could pick a place that actually exists. Now, from a producer standpoint, if you're raising money, attaching talent, getting distribution, you need to be able to pitch your projects. And if it takes 10 seconds to pitch your project instead of 10 minutes to pitch your project, that makes your project much easier to get across the starting line. So if you say, this is a story about a detective who goes after a very famous, sorry, this is a story about a detective who goes after a serial killer who targets children. And okay, so you might get to the end of that and nobody would be wowed because they'll go, yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about that. I don't know if I could really stand another one. But if you say about the detective who caught John Wayne Gacy, all right then. Even if it's not even if it's not about the detective who caught John Wayne Gacy, even if it's a total fictional story. The point is being able to incorporate the name of a famous killer or a famous anything into your story means it immediately becomes more relevant to somebody who's going to provide funding or going to provide any other asset or who is going to play a key role as talent. Incorporating these elements makes the project easier to pitch, and it makes them faster to pitch, and that gets you to the part where people go, "Oh, I understand what you're making. Wow, it sounds exciting. I do wanna help you." As opposed to, "Yeah, it's another story about another detective finding another serial killer. Big whoop. I'm not gonna find that all that interesting. I've heard that a million times." This is one of the reasons that you see producers more interested in screenplays that really do focus on real people and events or based on a true life story. So some authors actually go to the point where they find people and they say, hey, I want to write a screenplay based upon your life story or based upon your experiences and I wanna get your life right so that I can write that. And sometimes it's a producer that goes to a particular a famous individual, like maybe one who landed a plane on the Hudson and says, "Hey, I wanna buy the rights to your story." Sometimes it's a screenwriter who says, "I wanna, buy the rights to your story. We'll make a deal, I'll pay you this amount in order to and I'll interview you a bunch of times, I'll write the screenplay, and then I'll take it to Hollywood, and the project will get made into a film and you'll get more money." My point being, famous events, stories, famous people, these elements immediately attract more attention to your project and they make your project easier to get funding for, easier to sell, easier to produce, easier to market when they're finished. Famous places are a huge opportunity. Places and eras come with audiences. The truth is, no matter what project you're producing, you got to set it somewhere. And it kind of makes sense for you to choose a place that has fans. You really can set your project in any town USA, but is that going to make your project easier to sell? Probably not. What happens if you place your project in Manhattan? What happens if you place your project in Rome? What happens if you place your project in a major city that has major selling power? Because people wanna go there. If you think about it, that's why James Bond films feature so many exotic locations. Whenever you are participating in a Bond film, you know that you're gonna go on a vacation that takes you around the world. And if you think back to some of your favorite films, like one of my favorite films is one called Local Hero. And Local Hero is set in this little I think it's a little Scottish town, middle of nowhere. It's got a beautiful bay, and there's just this beautiful story that's set in a tiny location, but it is literally the most beautiful location on earth. I bet it costs literally nothing, literally nothing to get that location because it's just a line of houses on a beach. But it is a heartbreakingly beautiful film, and I'm sure that it made its money back, and I think it had everything. I think it probably drew 1,000,000 tourists to that particular town. I think not setting your project in a place that has a name or has special aspects that will make it much, much more attractive, to audiences and to filmmakers is a terrible mistake because it's a missed opportunity. It's also true that even fictional places have power. Setting instead of, setting a particular story on a miscellaneous island somewhere, why not set it on Atlantis? If you're gonna set it in a mythical location, why not put it at Xanadu or Mount Olympus? If you're gonna set it in the past or you wanna reference the past, why don't you set it at Petra? And if you think back, how many of the stories that you've truly loved, especially the ones that have gone really big, have been stories that intentionally leveraged location? National Treasure. What is National Treasure about? It's about literally wandering around wandering around Washington, DC, and nearby, looking at places where wonderfully historic things happened in the past. And if you think about many of the stories associated with Raiders of the Lost Ark or any of those kinds of adventure stories that Harrison Ford was involved in on multiple fronts, his projects tended to take you to locations that people wanted to see, and some of them weren't very expensive. That's the thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be the world's most expensive place. It just has to be a place that has a kind of a huge fan base. Also, I just want to mention in passing, eras have a particular fascination for many people. Some people really are fans of 1820, some are fans of 1920, some are fans of 2020. When you're picking a location for your story, pick a time for it as well and figure out why you're choosing that particular time. What happened in that year that made it special? What elements can you incorporate into your screenplay that can have an impact on your characters, that can have an impact on the story that everybody remembers? Because those moments of emotional tie-in make your project easier to pitch. They make it easier to sell, and they gather audiences to you because audiences feel a sense of community with the characters that you've put into your project. Famous, Popular tropes are important. They're very important. So, for those of you that don't know, a trope is something that audiences expect. If you're gonna put in a vampire, at some point that vampire has to kill people. That is what vampires do. They only do one thing, and they kill people. Most of the time, they bite people on the neck. This is an important thing for a vampire. If you're writing about romance, there's gonna be elements in there. There's the meet cute, and the meet cute could take different forms, but it's gonna be two people who don't hit it off right away, specifically because they meet each other in an awkward and unpleasant fashion, and then subsequently that causes a rift for a long time, and then all of a sudden it turns into being something that binds them together going forward, and that is the foundation of the romance between the two couples that have, met one another in a rom-com. Z The rush to the hospital because a baby's on the way, the aliens that, come at like children best. There are all these tropes that are very popular that people truly love, and incorporating them into your project makes people happy because most of us read books because we like specific tropes. If I like, Victorian novels that talk about, serial killers in the era of Jack the Ripper, the Victorian era, then I like The Fog. I like people wearing bowler hats. I like people wearing those long dresses. I like the truly going down dark alleys and people being stalked through a city that's illuminated only by gaslight. Those elements are important. And if you don't actually know what common tropes are for different versions of for different genre, I recommend you check out a look at tvtropes.org. It has an exhaustive list of all the tropes across romance, across science fiction, across mysteries. Every single kind of genre that you could conceivably be writing, and you can take a look at them and you'll recognize the ones that probably ought to be in your particular project. The tropes are important because they end up creating familiar scenes that people want to experience again and again and again and again. And you may think to yourself, that seems really trite. But the truth is, the universe really is filled with those kinds of moments. I have rushed people to the hospital to have a baby. I have rushed to a hospital bed because somebody is dying. Those are two very common tropes that appear in family dramas. The reason that they're tropes is because they happen in the real world, people recognize them, and they identify with them. Imagine you're trying to explain a film you just saw to someone. For example, it's a horror story set in a small seaside town in Maine where everything they bury comes back to life. When you incorporate tropes, it helps acquire an audience because you can incorporate them into a description. For example, it's a werewolf romance where an alpha meets his mate only to discover she's already in love with a vampire. Already, I feel like I've watched that movie. And if I like werewolves and I like alphas and I like vampires, I already like the movie because it's put a bunch of the tropes that I like in the description. Huge audiences with known interests are amazingly powerful when you incorporate them into your projects. Sometimes the audience actually is the story. We all remember Galaxy Quest. Remember, it's that story that's not really got anything about Star Trek in it, and yet you know from the very beginning that they are talking about Star Trek. And more importantly, they're talking about Star Trek and its very cool, very obsessed fan base. I don't know if you remember Galaxy Quest, but it starts with a bunch of actors who were on a science fiction show, being at a convention, and people outside are yelling for them to come out because the lead actor, who's very arrogant, much like William Shatner, has declined to arrive on time. So, right away from the very beginning, you're focused on the fact that these are actors who are at the mercy of this vast audience, and the audience is incredibly obsessed. It can tell you how many warp engines there are. It can just there's no aspect of that fictional story they don't know inside out, just like Tolkien fans, just, like Lord of the Rings fans are just like Harry Potter fans, right? The thing is, what Galaxy Quest actually focuses on the fans. It makes the fans, to some degree, the hero. The aliens that the people in Galaxy Quest go to see are fans of the show. The people that save the day are fans of the show. It because people identified so strongly with the people, the audience identified so strongly with the characters, even though they weren't actually the characters, they weren't really the Star Trek leads, right? They're just representations of them. And because it turned the fans into the heroes of the story, it just makes that a heartbreakingly great film. So if you're part of a fan base or a large group and you write stories that feature that group, you can make stories that are much easier to pitch and sell. You have a guaranteed audience. We've talked in the past, obviously, the rise of Christian media is about the fact that Christians have shared interests and they know what it means to be Christian. They're part of that club. So when you tell stories about Christian, you're talking about the audience, and that really helps them identify with your project and want to support it. The same is true with any vast base, whether it's baseball players or it's Beatles fans or just whatever huge group of people. If you can write a story about the huge group of people, it tends to make your project much easier to sell because everybody wants to be the hero of that story. Focusing on other creators is important. So, Julie and Julia was a story about a woman giving herself a new career as a writer, as a writer and a cook, actually, by cooking all the recipes in Julia Child's books. Now, this goes beyond merely mentioning her or doing a biopic. What you're doing is actually depicting a relationship between a character that lots and lots of people love and individuals that kind of represent the audience having a relationship. The story yesterday, the movie yesterday was similar in a way because really all it posited was that the Beatles had never gotten famous. And everybody that ever loved the Beatles just like we were riveted because we wanted to find out what happened to those guys. We wanted to find out. It was lovely when we saw John Lennon was still alive. And the hero goes all the way to see John Lennon. And even though he cannot believe he is living in a world where, in effect, he has become the Beatles because he's basically playing the tunes that that the Beatles created in this alternate universe. Still, he feels like maybe it's okay because John Lennon is still alive. You can create those kind of moments when you're talking about other creators that are really important to a lot of people. And if you have that kind of relationship with a particular character, if you are a total fan of a particular person, living or dead, fictional or real life, you can write a story that people like you will find very compelling if it features that other character. And I think a lot of people don't choose to do that because they don't know what rights they have. They don't know what they're allowed to do. And I really think if you're in that situation, you really should speak to an attorney and say, look, this is what I have in mind. Because you probably have more latitude than you think to create that kind of ode or that kind of homage. It's because to some degree, the nature of the laws inside the United States say that you have a right to incorporate the real world and even real people into your work if it's part of a story, which is why there was that story about Albert Einstein meeting Marilyn Monroe and them talking about life, marriage, losing a baby, and the speed of light and relativity. The reason that the screenwriter could put those characters together into a story, the reason they could write that story is because they have the right to tell the First Amendment kind of gives them a right to tell stories about real people when there's no or incorporate them as characters when there's no expectation that the story is factual. It's a fiction. And that's also the reason why Saturday Night Live is allowed to do a lot of the stuff it does, because it's not meant to be taken seriously and everybody knows it's not real. My point is, make sure that you understand the rules so that you can take advantage of them to your successfully going forward. If you're a physicist and you're writing a story about quantum entanglement and non-locality, it makes sense to put Einstein and Bohr into the project because might not know what quantum entanglement is, but they do know who Einstein is. And if they care about physics, they know who Bohr is. This lets you ensure your target market will understand exactly what your project is about and will help them virtually meet people that they very much admire. Finally, new facts and shocking information. If you can incorporate secrets we need to know into your project, if it's the secret information or information that has just been disclosed that you can weave into a narrative, it can be very powerful. For example, there was a project called Promised Land. I don't know if it necessarily made $1 billion, but if it had been produced for less money, it probably would have. It would have been very profitable. Promised Land was a story about fracking, and what it revealed was facts that a lot of people didn't know. For example, people who lived on the frack lands often had no idea of what fracking actually entailed, the fact that people were pumping toxins into the ground to break up the shale to release the oil, and they didn't realize the impact it would have on their crops or their well water or their health. More importantly, the whole rest of the world didn't even know that stuff either. Most of us thought people who were living on lands that were being fracked had agreed to it. But a lot of times the water rights were controlled by one person and the topsoil and the land and the people were farming on was controlled by others. So people could basically sell fracking on your land even without your permission because you don't own what happens underground, you only own what happens on top. So if you have surprising information that you can reveal and you can put it into a screenplay, it can open up a lot of doors for your project. Did you know is a really great way to start a pitch. If you can follow did you know with something that's really interesting or terrifying, it's it, what you say after that can translate into somebody saying, okay, I need to make a movie about that. A producer can see that and go, okay, everybody, I don't know that. Not everybody knows that. And I could totally see how your project's gonna be successful because a lot of people are gonna wanna know that, and you've got a whole screenplay that talks about it. New theories and factual revelations are very important. Sometimes people think they really know a story, but they really only know half truths. So being able to say, look, what they didn't tell you about Jack the Ripper's murders explains exactly why he wasn't caught. People go, oh, okay, there's something I don't know about Jack the Ripper. So I already like Jack the Ripper, and now you're giving me new information that I didn't know before. That is really interesting. It gives you a hook that makes it easy to carry people into listening to the rest of your pitch, and it also helps people who see the trailer for a film decide that they're going to go see it because you're promising them new information that they haven't heard yet. Even unverifiable, plausible revelations work. So, for example, the Da Vinci Code. Basically, the book just said maybe the guy sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper in the picture is a woman, not a man. And you look at the picture and you go, wow, maybe she is. And it's something you've never thought before. Now you have to go watch a whole movie about it because that's going to turn your world upside down. And it's only really speculation. As things stand, currently, the official position is that person sitting at the table next to Jesus is a man, not a woman. But we don't know because we have the Da Vinci Code. Looking around for shocking facts and revelations that you can build screenplays around, and considering what famous people and events you can tie them to, is a really powerful way to make your screenplays worth more. Sometimes even just a good theory can support a story. If you think about it, Jurassic Park is about the notion that some blood-sucking insects trapped in amber might have the DNA of extinct species. And from that, we can actually create new species. So that idea turned into a best-selling book and then turned into a huge film franchise. Just the idea. And it's not even something that can actually happen. It's just the idea that it could happen. It's plausible. If you look around the world and you notice a really shocking fact, or you read something and you think, "Oh my god, I did not know that was true," that could turn out to be a really great idea for you to incorporate into a screenplay, or even to build a whole screenplay around. Finally, if you have had unique experiences. So if you're a firefighter, a police officer, or a doctor, stuff behind the scenes that other people don't know. If you're a stewardess and you do long haul flights, stuff that people don't know. The cool thing is that you can incorporate those experiences into a screenplay, and all of a sudden you're telling secrets that people will be shocked by. And you will be bringing a visceral reality to the table that they would otherwise be incapable of experiencing. We all see the stewardesses on the plane, but we don't know what their lives are like. It's hard. We don't know where they sleep. We just figure they spend their whole time awake the entire 12-hour flight or 16-hour flight that we're on. We don't know about the undersides of the plane or the secret places on a plane, even where luggage is stored, or even that if it's possible to get into the luggage compartment. All of these kinds of secrets that get moved into a screenplay make the screenplay much more interesting to people, and they make your project easier to pitch because people think, wow, I did not know that. For example, I didn't know some firefighters really are pyromaniacs. We don't know that, but they like fire. And it just so happens that they go to fires, they watch them burn, and then they put them out. Sometimes they've even set fires. It's a strange world we live in. Or actually, I remember there were these two firefighters that I met who were a writing team. And one of them said, one of the things most people don't know, at least from our experience, is that most firefighters, the it's at least wherever we worked, it's always been more of like a frat house. These people do crazy things. Sometimes we get doors that we're supposed to test or new equipment we're supposed to test, and we go around destroying things, like trying to figure out hitting steel doors with hammers and then hitting it with blades and hitting it with hatchets and like trying to destroy it. And then one time we got a chainsaw we had to test on steel doors. We almost lost an eye. Like those kinds of experiences, revealing those kinds of truths are incredibly powerful. I think we can all look back to stories like ER, where they showed what it was like to work in a hospital. And obviously that's a story that's been told a lot of times, but but people are endlessly fascinated by hospitals and careers like that. So if you have those unique experiences, if you've actually lived them, bring that to the table. The fact that you're telling the story and you've had the experience and you're sharing stuff that people don't already know is really powerful from a pitch perspective, and also from when the film actually goes into production and selling the project going forward. And a final thing, focus on triumphs. I think many screenwriters, especially, and I say this especially about screenwriters, find a lot of useful catharsis in writing a lot of our scripts. And so a lot of them tend to have unhappy endings. The girl doesn't get the guy, doesn't get the girl. They don't get the job of their dreams. And we write these things because it's cathartic to us. We made our peace with it, and writing the story kind of helps us figure out why things happen. It's just the nature of being a creative person. But it really is easy to sell your stories when they're about someone who solves a problem, or how someone survived when they should have died, or how someone started from behind but took the lead in real life. Hero stories of triumphing over terrible odds really do sell better than stories about epic failures and losses. And I defy you to look at the last 200 years of film and show me the percentage of these projects showed me that a majority of these projects were about tragedy and about the hero losing. The vast majority of them about people winning. So if you want to be on the side where you're going to get your projects produced, generally speaking, it's going to have a happy ending, not a sad ending. And that's just the truth. That's just the way the world works because people like media that makes them feel like they can be successful, that they can be effective, that they can change their lives rather than ones that tell them that they're doomed. Even stories like The Godfather, which I actually think The Godfather is a tragedy. When you watch the film, it feels like a big win because he ends up in one day destroying all the clear and present dangers to his family. The fact that he loses his soul in the process, it's a mixed thing, isn't it? But you go, the new Don Corleone is very effective. I thought Michael was a nicer guy than that. Now he's just always going to be this monster, but his family's safe. And maybe that's the trade he had to make, right? In that instance, The Godfather's a tragedy, but it looks like a happy ending because materially he gets everything anyone could want. If you take a long, hard look at what you buy and what you watch from a media perspective, you'll find specific creative elements in almost all of them, and it was likely those key elements that made the project viable financially. These elements connect you to the story at the critical moment when you had to decide to watch it. They don't make the story good necessarily, but they do make people invest time in finding out if it's good. So the 10 elements that I've talked about in this particular project are elements you can easily incorporate into almost any work that you create. And when you're writing for money, you probably should think about incorporating some or all of them. And you should really think about how during the pitch, these elements can be brought to the forefront so that people are immediately connected to the project, immediately say, I want to know more, immediately feel like, wow, I know the experience I'm going to have when I watch this film and I really like it. Because this will translate into people saying, okay, I see that this can go big, as opposed to when you're writing something that's personal, of the heart, isn't really attached to the outside world. They understand that it's intimate, but they don't know how they're gonna sell it to other people, and that is really a problem for producers, which makes it a problem for makes it a problem for screenwriters. Finally, let's talk for a second about the word content. So screenplays are intellectual property, just like any other physical property that you might buy, just like an apartment building that you might own, just like a house that you might rent, just like a car that you might sell to someone else. They're property. So most likely your screenplay won't sell. It might be because you didn't pitch it. Could be because you don't find the right person to pitch it to. It's really dead if you don't move it into another media when that's the case. The fact that your screenplays are IP means that it's not confined to a particular format. A screenplay can become a book, can become a podcast, can become a play. And all of those give you new opportunities to make money from it. When you see your creative work as content, you're significantly better off. We, as writers, have strong opinions about the world, and those ideas get poured into our projects. But we have to be really careful not to be rigid about the path that our work takes to reach people. Content can go anywhere. So when you define your work as a screenplay and you say, I have written a screenplay, my work is not content, my work is just a screenplay. A screenplay is a screenplay, and that's all it can be. Okay, but if your screenplay doesn't sell, that means that is time that you've wasted. That's a story that nobody's ever going to hear. You're never going to make money off of it. How is that a good thing for you? So seeing your work consciously as content, realizing that you like to write screenplays, you can write as many screenplays as you want. And if they don't sell as screenplays, you can turn them into books, you can turn them into podcasts, you can even turn them into stage plays if you want. What begins as with a story that begins as a screenplay does not have to remain a screenplay. It can go a lot of places. And that can help you guarantee your personal satisfaction as well as your financial success. The more you write and the more inviting elements you put into your projects as a screenwriter, the more likely you are to see success. And from a producer perspective, when you see a project that was perhaps originally written as a screenplay and then it became a successful podcast, that's a good indication that the screenplay probably is also going to become a successful film. So one of the reasons that producers look hard at people who have written books or look at the books that have been successful is because they know the project has been proven. They know for a fact that there's a market for the project. When you're looking at, screenplays and you're thinking about acquiring a screenplay and you're not sure if it's gonna be successful, maybe you need to think about getting permission from the author, buying the rights, not only to produce the project as a film, but also to write a book, so you can market the book, and then if the book does well, you'll know that it's got legs enough to be able to turn into a movie that people will like. There's no reason a producer can't choose to do that. It's a good investment if they wanna be able to road test something before they actually spend a lot of money turning it into, a film that may or may not have a market. The market for a book is, generally speaking, the same market for a film. If the book sells, chances are the film will also be successful. I'm gonna take questions in just a second. I do wanna put in a couple of practical words here because I think it's important. People often wonder, how do I know what's actually selling? How can I get an actual answer about what people are actually buying right at this moment and who's actually doing the buying? If you go to donedealpro.com, you can sign up for a $30 a year subscription, and you will be able to see a list of all the screenplays that are being sold, whether for films or they're being incorporated into TV projects. So go check out Done Deal Pro. It's worth the $30. Also, you'll be able to see who's actually selling them. You'll be able to see the agents and the managers that are actually getting their clients' projects to market. Do check out We Screenplay to get coverage and notes. As a screenwriter, you can take your screenplay that you have written and you can hand it to 50 people in your family, and they will never give you notes that have any kind of usefulness or meaning because none of those people are producers. If you can give your screenplay to people that produce the kind of project that you're working on, you should definitely use them to get your notes. That totally makes sense. If you don't have that access to the market, I think I like to use personally We Screenplay. I go to We Screenplay. I say I want to get 5 reviews, 5 coverage notes simultaneously. I give them whatever money they want. I think it's always been like $400, $300 or whatever. I get notes back. And I can actually even specify that I want people that have been involved in producing and development. Like I could specify the characteristics of the people that I'm getting notes from. The notes that I get back from that process are so much better than the notes I get back from other writers, better than the notes that I get back from family and friends. They're just altogether better. So I personally think getting real coverage from real people makes a big difference. If you're looking for people, start looking for a way to start trying to meet producers or getting connected to producers. Check out inktip.com, screenwritingstaffing.com, networkisa.org, because there a lot of times they'll be posting gigs for producers who are looking for specific scripts. It's a way to begin. If you want to have coaching or you want to get mentors, I suggest you take a look at Roadmap Writers. One of the things that's unique about them is you can say, hey, I want to get advice from somebody who works in development at a studio. I want their advice because I want to sell my project to a studio. Now, I think trying to sell your project to a studio when you haven't had any success previously is a bit of a challenge, but the point is that if you have produced 1 or 2 small projects or you have sold 1 or 2 small projects and you're looking to step up, roadmap writers may be able to set up a relationship with people who can give you practical advice. And you can buy ongoing support, or you can buy just meetings by the hour or whatever. At least that last time I checked, that's how they ran. I mentioned in passing that filmmakers can get distribution through filmhub.com, indierights.com, rightstraight.com. It's really easy to get distribution. There's a million different ways to get distribution. And if you don't know about these things, you might want to check into them. The trick is not getting your project distributed. It's not even getting it on the TV. The trick is getting paid for it and getting paid enough to cover your costs. All right. I mentioned in passing I don't get paid for any endorsements. I just recommend people that I like, and I recommend stuff that I think's cool. You should just my personal opinion. Hope maybe your experience may end up differing. So you should definitely look for the solutions that work for you. All right, let me just go ahead and check up here and see what the chat says. All right. Sharon mentions Philadelphia. Yes, the movie Philadelphia actually literally featured Philadelphia. That's a perfectly accurate example. Cool. Let me go ahead and check to see what the next Q&A is. All right. Yes. Okay. So somebody mentions writing about real people can get you in big trouble. That's actually true. If you are writing a story about your family's personal history and you happen to talk about your sisters and you out them as victims of sexual abuse, or you out your father as a bank robber, and you out your cousin as a shady businessman who sold cars that didn't work, all of those things can get you in trouble because you're talking about people that you actually know and you're making allegations about them, and that's just a bad mistake to make. You should not be doing that. But if you it's a different thing when you're talking about Henry VIII or you're talking about Elizabeth II or any dead person. And it's even a different thing when you're talking about living people who are very famous. Obviously, people have incorporated people like Gore and President Clinton and President Obama and lots of politicians into their projects, both living and dead. So you need to understand things like right of publicity, and you need to understand fair use, and you need to understand copyright. You need to understand all of these kinds of things, and you need to get a grounding. If you go onto the workshops that are on the site and you Google copyright, sorry, not Google. If you go onto NFM24 and you search for copyright, you search for right of publicity, all of these things will really help you get attached. Valika asks, why are Romeo and Juliet so eternally successful? I think they're successful because the they're written by Shakespeare. So people there's nothing more powerful than taking a story that people are already familiar with, that they've already attached themselves to, and then saying, "Hey, I've got a new spin on it." Whether that spin is West Side Story, whether that spin is something that features Leonardo DiCaprio, whether that spin is something that's set on the moon. The point is people already know the story. They're already bought into it. It's like hearing a fairy story, that or a fairy tale that they already know the ending of. And even though it's a tragedy, in a sense, Romeo and Juliet get even with their families. They teach their families a serious lesson, and that is a seriously satisfying thing. I think it's more of, and actually, if you can get Romeo and Juliet where they don't die, people might really like that as well. I've often thought it was interesting that Hamlet, which is a great tragedy, a very comforting tragedy, so to speak. What's interesting is a lot of the newer versions of Hamlet I've seen are actually making it so that Ophelia doesn't die. Because with Ophelia, she's actually a pretty cool character, and it does seem unfair that the girl dies. Why does she have to die? If Romeo thinks her dead, that's just about as good. If she turns out she runs off with somebody or she runs away, that would be better, actually. We should make her take the potion that makes her look asleep, and then we should let her leave because there's no reason for her to end up in the grave. My point being that familiar stories are always very successful. The other thing is Romeo and Juliet are outside of copyright, so they tend to get made a lot, just like Hamlet. It's interesting. I think people have more trouble with Othello because that is a story about violence toward women, and people don't like that nearly as much. It's not a romance, which is Romeo and Juliet definitely is, and Hamlet and Ophelia are as well. Hamlet's trying to get rid of Ophelia. Obviously, she's in a war zone. He wants her to like stop loving him, and that's especially because he's going to be dead, and it doesn't work out so well because she can't help loving him. So it's a more tragic story, but it's not as bad as Othello, where he actually kills that girl for no reason at all. And it's funny because I don't think that is nearly as popular a story, and I also don't think Macbeth is also troublesome as well, but not as even as it's still somewhat better, I think, ghost story wise than it's a ghost story, which is good. You get a lot. It's safer to do from that perspective. Othello is very real world. It's not a ghost story. Othello's wife actually does die. And so not every Shakespeare story works. A lot of them do. But if you can tie your story into Shakespeare, it might be a very successful thing to do because people do like that. And that's how we end up with stuff like Shakespeare in Love. All right, I'm going to go ahead and you already have access to these notes. I hope they will be helpful to you. And here's the thing. I hope the message you take away from this is write a lot. And it may be the case that you start just by writing, instead of writing a whole screenplay, consider just writing sort of the outline of a screenplay, right? Write what you would do and follow the 9-act structure or something and write the beats, or write the beats as if you were writing them to fill in the steps of the hero's journey. Do that, and do that for a lot of different screenplays, and sooner or later, you'll find some that you really wanna write. The more you write, the more you have to sell, the more you schmooze with producers and with you meet people in the industry, the more likely you are to be successful. What's not gonna work is just writing one screenplay, not pitching it to anybody, and not incorporating any of the elements that we've talked about that make it easy to sell, easy to promote. That just is gonna make it so that you don't have a lot of satisfaction from your work. If you have any questions, I very much hope you do reach out to me at Nancy at nancyfultonmeetups.com.